I had always considered myself a man of discipline, someone who kept feelings and work in separate compartments. But that sense of order began to unravel the moment I noticed Armin, my boss's son. He carried himself with an ease that made everyone turn their heads, yet he never seemed aware of the effect he had on people. His laughter traveled through corridors like music, and even the most mundane meetings seemed lighter when he entered the room. I worked for his father, Mr. Kamal, a man known for his rigid rules and serious demeanor. My job was steady, predictable, and safe. But Armin's presence disturbed that safety. He was warmth where his father was cold, spontaneity where his father was rigid. I tried to ignore the way my heart shifted when he lingered near my desk or the way my stomach tightened when his eyes lingered on me a second too long. When the company announced a team tour, a short trip meant to blend relaxation with strategy, my first thought was how closely I'd be working with Mr. Kamal. My second thought, which I refused to admit aloud, was that Armin would be there too. I told myself it was foolish to think about him in that way, but desire has a way of ignoring reason. The day of departure arrived with the chaos of early morning luggage, chatter, and hurried instructions. I watched Armin load his bag into the bus, his hair slightly tousled from lack of sleep. He caught my glance and offered a half-smile that seemed to say more than words could manage. My chest tightened, and I turned away quickly, pretending to adjust my seat. The ride stretched across open highways and quiet villages. Colleagues laughed, sang, and dozed off in their seats. I tried to distract myself by staring out the window, but Armin's reflection in the glass betrayed me every time. At one point, he leaned into the aisle and asked if I wanted to share a packet of chips. The gesture was small, almost meaningless, but when our hands brushed, the electricity lingered long after the crumbs were gone. By the time we reached the resort, dusk was settling in. The air smelled of pine and damp soil, a refreshing change from the city's heavy dust. Rooms were assigned, schedules were distributed, and people scattered off to explore. I carried my bag to my room, grateful for the moment of solitude. But solitude was short-lived. A knock came at my door, and when I opened it, Armin stood there with his usual effortless charm. "Just checking if you settled in," he said casually, though his eyes searched mine in a way that felt less casual. I nodded, suddenly aware of the space between us, or rather how little space there was. He glanced around my room, then leaned against the doorway as though he belonged there. We spoke briefly about the trip, about how tiresome the ride had been, about how his father was already buried in paperwork despite the supposed holiday. Yet beneath every word, I sensed an unspoken current pulling us closer. Later that evening, the group gathered for dinner. The dining hall was filled with clinking glasses, laughter, and the clatter of plates. I found myself seated 2 chairs away from Armin, close enough to hear his voice, but not close enough to meet his eyes freely. He teased a colleague about their poor singing on the bus, and when he laughed, his gaze flicked to me. I looked away quickly, though my cheeks warmed under the weight of his attention. The night ended with people scattering back to their rooms, some planning card games, others collapsing from fatigue. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every glance, every brush of the hand, every unspoken word. I knew I was teetering on a dangerous edge. Falling for Armin meant betraying the trust of the man who had given me my livelihood. And yet, the thought of suppressing what I felt seemed equally unbearable. As sleep finally began to overtake me, one realization anchored itself in my mind. This trip was no ordinary escape from work. It was the beginning of something I could neither fully resist nor entirely understand. I had always considered myself a man of discipline, uneventful, someone who kept feelings and work in separate retreated to their rooms. But that sense of order began to unravel the moment I noticed to their phones. My boss's son. I tried to read. He carried himself with an ease that made everyone turn their heads. Each line blurred, seemed aware of the effect he had on people. Armin. His laughter traveled through corridors in my music. His glance even the most mundane meetings seemed lighter. The silence of the room felt heavy. I worked for his father, Mr. Kamal, of the wooden floor, a man known for his rigid rules and the serious demeanor. I lay on the bed. My job was steady, staring at the faint light and filtering through the curtains. But Armin's presence disturbed that safety. For a moment, he was warmth where his father was cold. It was late, too late
spontaneity,
for casual
where
visits.
his father was rigid.
I opened the door cautiously.
I tried to ignore the
and
way
there
my
he
heart
was,
shifted when he
framed
lingered
by the
near my
dim
desk,
hallway
or
light.
the way my
His
stomach
expression
tightened
half
when his eyes
playful,
lingered on me a
half
second
nervous.
too long.
Couldn't
When
sleep.
the company announced
Armin
a
said
team
softly,
tour, a
his
short
voice
trip
carrying
meant to
to blend
both
relaxation
ease and
with
hesitation.
strategy.
My
Mind
first
if I
thought
sit
was
for a
how
while?
closely I'd be working
I should have
with
said
Mr.
no.
Kamal. I should
My
have thought
second
of
thought,
Mr.
which
Kamal,
I refused to
of
admit
the
aloud,
boundaries I was
that
bound to
Armin
respect.
would be there too.
But I stepped
I
aside,
told myself it was
and
foolish
Armin
to
walked
think
in
about him
as
in
though
that
the
way,
choice had
but
already
desire
been made
has a
for
way
me.
of ignoring
He dropped
reason.
onto the chair near
The
the
day of
desk,
departure
leaning
arrived
back
with the
chaos
carelessness
of early
of
morning
someone who had
language,
never worried
chatter,
about consequences.
and hurried instructions.
I sat across from
I
him
watched
on the bed,
Armin load his bag
trying
into
to
the
act
bus.
unaffected.
His hair
For a while,
slightly tousled
we
from
spoke
lack
about
of sleep.
trivial things.
He caught my glance
the long
and
ride,
offered a half
the
smile
beauty
that
of the
seemed
resort,
to say more
the
than
annoyance
words
of
could manage.
mosquitoes.
My
Yet
chest
underneath,
tightened, and
there was
I
something
turned away
else,
quickly,
a charged
pretending to
silence
adjust my
pressing
seat.
between us.
The
Whenever
ride
words
stretched across
paused.
open highways
Do you ever feel
and
trapped?
quiet villages.
Armin asked
Colleagues
suddenly.
laughed.
The question
sang,
startled me,
and dozed
trapped.
off in their seats.
In expectations,
I tried to
he
distract
clarified,
myself by
his gaze
staring out the
fixed on
window,
the floor.
but Armin's
My father
reflection in the
thinks he
glass
knows the
betrayed
path I should
me
take.
every time.
He thinks he knows me.
At one point,
But he doesn't.
He leaned into the
He
aisle,
lifted his eyes
and asked if I
locking
wanted
onto
to share
mine
a
with
packet
an
of chips.
intensity that
The
made my
gesture
breath
was small,
falter.
almost
Sometimes
meaningless.
I just want to be
But
myself.
when our hands
without
brushed,
anyone watching,
the electricity lingered
his
long
honesty
after the
cracked
crumbs were
something
gone.
open inside
By the
me.
time we reached
I
the
admit
resort,
it.
in a
Dusk
voice
was
quieter
settling
than
in.
I intended,
The air
that I
smelled of
often felt
pine
the
and
same,
damp soil,
bound by duty,
a refreshing change
careful
from
to
the
appear
city's
proper,
heavy dust.
never allowing
Rooms were
myself to want
assigned,
what I truly
schedules
wanted.
were distributed,
The air
and
thickened
people
with the
scattered
weight
off
of truths we
weren't
I
supposed to
carried
share.
my bag to my
Armin
room,
stood,
grateful
pacing
for the
slowly
moment
toward
of
the window,
solitude. Then
but
back toward me.
solitude was
He
short-lived.
stopped only a step
A knock
away,
came at my door,
close enough that I could
and when
see
I
the
opened
faint
it,
rise
Armin
and
stood
fall
there
of
with
his
his
usual effortless
"You're different,"
charm.
he said.
Just checking
I
if
don't
you
have to
settled in.
pretend with you.
He said
The
casually.
room shrank around
though his
us.
eyes searched mine
I
in a
felt
way
both
that
drawn
felt
in
less
and
casual.
terrified.
I nodded,
caught between
suddenly aware of the
and
space
longing.
between us.
My
Or
heart
rather,
thudded
how little
so
space
loudly
there
I
was.
wondered if he
He
could hear
glanced
it.
around my
Armin,
room, then leaned against the
whispered,
doorway as
though I
though
didn't
he
know what I
belonged
meant to
there.
say.
We spoke
Warning,
briefly about
plea,
the trip,
or surrender.
about how tiresome
But he
the ride
sat
had
down
been,
beside me,
about how his
his shoulder
father was
brushing
already
mine,
buried,
and
in
the meaning
paperwork
became
despite
clear
the
without
supposed
further
holiday.
words. Yet
We
beneath
talked
every
in
word,
hushed tones.
I sensed
Voices
an
barely
unspoken
above
current
whispers,
pulling us closer.
as if the walls themselves
Later that
might
evening,
betray
the
us.
group gathered
He
for dinner.
confessed small
The dining
secrets,
hall was filled
how
with
he envied
clinking
people who
glasses,
lived freely,
laughter,
how
and
he
the
feared
clatter of
becoming a
plates.
copy of his
I
father.
found myself
I
seated
listened,
2 chairs away
each
from
word
Armin,
deepening my
close
sense
enough
of
to hear his
connection,
voice, but
each
not
pause
close enough
heightening
to
the
meet his eyes
unspoken
freely.
tension.
He
At
teased
one
a colleague
point,
about their poor
our
singing
hands
on the
rested
bus,
too
and
close
when he
on the
laughed,
bedspread,
his gaze flicked to
and
me.
the distance
I looked away
disappeared.
quickly,
His
though
fingers
my
grazed
cheeks mine,
warmed under the
not
weight
by
of his
accident,
attention.
but by
The
choice.
night ended with people
Deliberate
scattering
and
back to their
fragile.
rooms.
The
Some
touch
planning
sent a
card
jolt
games,
through me,
others
a confirmation
collapsing from
of
fatigue.
everything we
I
had
lay
tried
awake,
to hide beneath
staring at the
conversation.
ceiling,
The
replaying
hours slipped
every
away
glance,
unnoticed.
every brush
We
of the
laughed
hand,
softly,
every
we confessed.
unspoken word.
We allowed
I
the
knew
world
I was
outside
teetering
to
on a
dissolve
dangerous
until it was
edge.
only us in that
Falling
room.
for Armin
Yet
meant
beneath the
betraying the
comfort,
trust of the
guilt
man who had
coiled
given me my
tightly,
livelihood,
reminding
and
me
yet,
of the fragile
the
line
thought of
we had
suppressing
already
what I
crossed.
felt seemed
When the
equally
clock struck
unbearable.
past midnight,
As sleep
Armin
finally
leaned
began
back,
to overtake
eyes
me,
heavy with fatigue,
one
but
realization
unwilling
anchored
to
itself
leave.
in my mind.
This night,
This
he
trip
said,
was no
his voice
ordinary
almost
escape
a
from
promise.
work. It
Will
was the
stay with
beginning
me.
of something
I
I
wanted
could
to
neither
answer,
fully resist,
but
nor
words
entirely
deserted me.
understand. Instead, I looked at him, memorizing the curve of a smile, the way the dim light softened his features. I knew then that I was no longer just balancing attraction. I was entangled in something I could neither deny nor easily escape. The night ended without resolution, yet with everything changed. As he finally rose to leave, his hand lingered on the doorframe, his glance holding mine a moment too long. When the door closed, the silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with the certainty that nothing between us would ever be the same again. This section builds on the tension, develops character vulnerability, and ends with a decisive emotional shift, while still holding back for the final act. The morning sun spilled across the resort, golden light bouncing off pine needles and damp grass. Outside, colleagues chatted over breakfast, their voices blending with the clatter of cutlery and the distant hum of birds. It should have been an ordinary morning, but nothing felt
ordinary to me. The memory of Armin sitting on the edge of my bed, his words echoing in the silence, had altered everything. When I entered the dining hall, I caught sight of him immediately. He was surrounded by others, laughing easily, his presence as magnetic as ever. Yet now, every smile he offered carried a hidden layer, one only I could decipher. For a moment, our eyes met across the room, and the corner of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. No one else noticed, but the quiet recognition sent a rush of heat through me. I forced myself to sit with colleagues, to engage in polite conversation about the day's schedule, hiking, sightseeing, group activities. Still, my thoughts drifted back to the night before, to the way Armin had spoken about freedom and truth, to the way his hand had lingered against mine. I felt both elated and guilty, caught between the sweetness of intimacy and the weight of betrayal. Mr. Kamal entered the hall halfway through breakfast, his stern presence casting a shadow that made everyone adjust their posture. I lowered my gaze, aware of the secret I now carried. The man who trusted me, who provided me work and stability, had no idea his son, and I had crossed a line he would never forgive. The realization stung, but it did nothing to erase what had already taken root in my heart. The day unfolded in a blur of activity. We hiked narrow trails, posed for group photos, and shared stories around a bonfire in the evening. From the outside, I was just another participant, but inside I was balancing two selves, the loyal employee and the man who longed for something forbidden. Armin, with his usual charm, played his part well. He laughed, teased, and entertained, yet every so often his glance slid toward me, brief but burning. Later that night, back in my room, I replayed the day's events. The secrecy had given our bond a strange intensity, as though the risk itself deepened the connection. But I couldn't escape the gnawing question: what came next? Was this only a fleeting encounter, born of circumstance and solitude? Or was it the beginning of something neither of us could control? My thoughts were interrupted by another knock. My pulse quickened, but when I opened the door, it was only a colleague reminding me of tomorrow's departure. Relief mingled with disappointment. I realized then how much I had already begun to crave Armin's presence, how quickly he had become essential to my restless heart. On our final morning, the bus ride back was quieter. Exhaustion weighed on everyone, but for me, it was the heaviness of unspoken words. Armin sat a few rows ahead, earbuds in, head resting against the window. The glass reflected his profile, and I found myself memorizing it as though afraid it would vanish. At one stop, he lingered near me while others bought snacks. "Last night," he said softly, "I almost came again." I searched his face, unsure what to reply. "And why didn't you?" He smiled faintly, eyes flicking toward the others. "Because if I had, I might not have left." The bus horn cut the moment short, pulling us back into the roles we had to play. He returned to his seat, and I returned to mine, but the words stayed with me, reverberating through every mile of the journey home. When we finally reached the city, people dispersed with casual goodbyes, laughter, and promises to meet soon. Armin and I exchanged only a brief handshake, nothing unusual in the eyes of others, but in that touch lay the entire weight of what had passed between us. As I walked away, the world resumed its ordinary rhythm, yet inside me everything had changed. I carried both the joy of having known him in a way no one else had, and the burden of knowing it was a story I could never tell. It was a secret etched into silence, a faceless memory that belonged only to us. And though the future was uncertain, one truth remained. That night at the resort had marked me forever, a forbidden flame that neither time nor distance could fully extinguish.